Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for an Awake Security webinar titled CISO Perspectives, Ethical and Policy Implications for AI in Cybersecurity. Today, AI is everywhere around us. It drives our cars, secures our networks, acts as virtual assistants in our homes, and just this week, I saw there is a little AI bot that has been delivering groceries from the store straight to your home. With machines getting more intelligent by the day, it's important to think about the ethical, policy, and privacy implications of AI. What about the privacy of the training data set? How do we make sure the AI helps rather than hurts human productivity? Those are just a few of the questions we have. And luckily for us, we have Malcolm Harkins, someone who has been thinking about these questions for a while and can share the insights he has developed. Malcolm serves as a CISO advisor to our board of directors and leadership team. Currently serving as the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cymatic, he previously had the same role at endpoint security AI leader Cylance. Malcolm also served as the Chief Security and Privacy Officer of Intel for more than a decade. He has received numerous awards and recognition and is a frequent speaker at industry events, published many articles, and is the author of Managing Risk Information Security, Protect, Enable. If you have questions or technical difficulties, please use the Q&A and chat feature in Zoom. Malcolm, over to you.
Thanks, and happy to be here and share some thoughts on this. As you kind of mentioned with my past, and particularly the past few years with my involvement, we're directly in the security, with Cylance at the forefront of using AI and endpoint protection. Cymatic, the company that I'm now working with, using AI in the web security space. Awake is an advisor that uses AI in the context of network security, and even dating back into my Intel days. Intel was developing and creating technology well into the future. And so I had the option and the responsibility to be talking to privacy officer to participate and be with these as a part of Intel's Corporate Ethics and Compliance Oversight Committee that oversaw ethics and compliance across the aspect of the business. And so I've been wrestling with some of the moral dilemmas in some cases with technology for a long time. And, as it talked about AI being everywhere, it wasn't that long ago that we were just starting to talk big data and data and the use of back my Intel days, circa 2006, 2007, the security team, or even the whole end user behavior analytics and all that stuff started to bring, as we were seeing emergence of advanced persistent threats, as we saw potential insider risk, and there was a person that served time in federal prison for stealing a few $100 million of intellectual property during that time period. We started trying to instrument and figure out what we could do. And so we had built at that time, it's probably different nowadays, but in the mid 2000s, 2006, 7, 8, the largest big data implementation at Intel. And we were using that and trying to get into machine learning and predictive analytics to try and figure out things. And it's just pervased into every aspect of our world. You mentioned the AI bot delivering groceries, but got it in our enterprises and different intelligence capabilities. You have even things like Salesforce and some of the marketing solutions are starting to add AI the past few years. You had typical enterprise functions, whether it be customer support and the chat bots and again, sales, security we've already talked about, recruiting, or even, retention of employees, instrumenting systems to look for, patterns and predictors of employees perhaps turning over. Obviously autonomous systems have become big across the past few years, but the assist agents, so administrative AIs that will calendar your schedules, and again, it's across every industry, healthcare, and again, it's permeating almost every aspect of the technology stack. And so when we look at this broadly, there's a variety of security and privacy implications that we need to think about. not only how we use AI in the context of security to, in essence, create a better mechanism to prevent, detect, and respond, but also how do we look at the AI companies are using and what we're buying from vendors and the security and privacy implications of the AI there, or the AI we might be creating on our own, to again enhance different aspects of our business. So again, a wide variety of things we need to think about from these ethical perspectives. And in my view of this, for a Chief Information Security Officer, my role is Chief Security and Trust Officer because I use them interchangeably, is the CISO or Chief Security Officer needs to watch out just the typical InfoSec security domain that we typically have looked at the past couple of decades, and really stress themselves into these broader aspects of ethics and privacy and the policy beyond just the sector policy side. And for that, it also can cause an unintentional harm. AI is no different than that. Security systems are no different than that. My biggest fear back when I was at Intel, when I was at Silence, even Cymatic, is again the security being used for harm. Right? Think back, we've all seen the ransomware stuff the past several years. I was worried about the equivalent of ransomware 15 years ago, and somebody, either an insider or a malicious individual, getting a hold of our key management systems and the encryption capability on our laptops and basically locking us out of the data. So I was worried about that type of, in essence, ransomware back then. Different context, different mechanism to do it, but we have to think about that when it comes to security. And again, obviously AI in the context of security is no different, because again, if that AI has flaws in the logic, that could then again be used to create harm. It could have a bias in it that starts taking different action than we otherwise would have intended. And we'll talk about the cause of those things, sometimes how to wrestle through to understand how to sort through these issues, because they're pretty thorny. And sometimes the technical answer isn't enough. You have to kind of widen out to some of these policy and other dimensions to evaluate the potential for harm. And when you start doing that, you start looking at systems, small decisions taken together can have very large implications. A non-AI example of this, but one that I reflect on in the books that I've written and constantly as a reminder for me. We all probably remember, those of us that are old enough, SQL Slammer. And in the context of SQL Slammer, back in January 2002, at Intel, as we were responding to that, where we consumed 10,000 man hours in under a week to keep the company kind of from tipping over, considering the network saturation we were seeing. But that SQL Slammer incident came from a home system. So again, this also has implications with COVID-19 and more remote workers. But at that time, we had allowed, in essence, bring your own device home systems to log into Intel's network through VPN and that type of stuff. But SQL Server came onto Intel's network through that mechanism. And because of the pain, because of the issues, it's put a policy, Intel managed policy, that you had to have only a managed system on the network. RIP, regime control, other things, but that decision created other issues, because even contractors and things like that, we had to buy them systems. So we incurred a significant cost, but then all of those other systems that came on, particularly for contractors and auditors and stuff, they were a full network node on my network. So I actually went to manage one risk and I actually created other ones. And so sometimes, again, when we think about that in the context of AI and the implications, what features do you extract, how do you extract them, what actions do you take on them, they might seem small, but we need to, again, kind of branch predict out in time what those ripple effects might be, again, in order to assess the risk. We've got obviously different industries, different geographies that we operate in, or a multinational company that might operate in multiple geographies. And so you have different legal and regulatory implications. You have sometimes different values in a particular society that could allow for certain things or cause restraints against those things. And, you know, again, I've seen that. You go into Europe and you've got works council issues and different privacy laws. Sometimes there are systems that are collecting and processing data on the machine that have inference possibilities on the employee, but then you have to, again, go through a whole set of things with the works council to figure out if they will allow that or not allow it. And then the ever-present question of, you know, what happens if the AI systems has learned from a biased human decision? We all have biases, right? I've said long time ago that the greatest vulnerability we have today and in the future is the misperception of risk, and that misperception of risk is driven to some extent by humans and the perspectives that we have, the measurements that we're held accountable to, the educational backgrounds we have, the organizational structure we're in, that can sometimes create just small nuances to how things get done that, again, can lead to potential issues. It doesn't always have to be, but we have to be cognizant of those things. Now, again, there's a variety of research publications, both in the US, Europe, other public policy institutions. This one is from the Council of Europe, and it was actually a very well-written article, a few dozen pages on discrimination, artificial intelligence, and algorithmic decision-making. And I think this quote says it all. You know, the math or computational constructs don't by themselves have adverse human impacts. You know, they're benign of that themselves. Their implementation and application to human interactions does. And in the context of AI systems that are making decisions, again, it was an organization. It was a set of individuals that decided to use the AI for that task. So we can't absolve ourselves of that implementation and the repercussions of it, even if it's something that we've bought, let alone something that we've built, because we're the ultimate decision makers on that, and we can't absolve ourselves of that responsibility. So we have some obligation to understand it in the AI that our organizations are buying and the AI that we're buying ourselves for our own security team, our own security needs. Now, you know, in my title the past number of years, I've had the title of trust. And that's been very intentional by me as well as the organizations I've worked for. And I still think all of this boils down to trust. And so how do you think about trustworthy AI, right? How do you make sure that it's secure? How do you make sure that it's dealing with the privacy implications appropriately, that our use of the data is appropriate, the actions we're taking is appropriate? And it has to be done in the design, right, the construction phase, like your security development lifecycle. Has to be done in again, that further development, the engineering and finalization of the AI capabilities, and then certainly in the implementation and application of it, like we just talked about. And first and foremost, we're all, you know, subject to laws around the world. And so we have to make sure that what we're doing and how we're doing it complies with applicable laws. You know, basic item that we all want to strive for. It sometimes can be a little bit nutty. Sometimes you can have some conflicting laws. Sometimes you can have a lot of barriers, but by and large, we have to do that. Now, when you get into ethics, this is ensuring adherence to ethical principles and values. And I'll explain a little bit more on principles and values on that, how I interpret and look at ethics, particularly from a broader technology sense and as well in the artificial intelligence sense. And then robust. And by robust, I mean it needs to be technically sound, right? We're doing the right QA on it, but also validated socially sound. Have we thought beyond the technology and thought again about the societal and social implications, even if it's just within the work environment? There are things that we shouldn't be doing, or we need to think about, if we do them, how we manage those implications within the bounds of the values and the organization employee trust that we need to establish for our organizations. And the thing to think about is there's a lot of organizations that go, well, I'm compliant. Well, there's a difference between being compliant with the law and being ethical. You know, ethics informs the laws which are passed, but it goes beyond them. And I've always strived for, probably because I grew up in an organization, again, at Intel, that had an ethics and compliance. We saw them together, but we also distinctly saw them different. You could be legal, but doing things unethical, or you could be legal, but doing things that might be touching on a set of values and cultural aspects within your organization. And again, I would urge you to think about these things, recognize that they are, is why I drew it as a Venn diagram, they push and pull on each other, and they are intertwined. So you need to look at them uniquely as a separate lens, but then bring them together in order to have a holistic answer in terms of what you do, how you do it, and understanding in the broader context why you're doing it. Which brings me to culture. The basis for me when I look at controls, and I'm an old-fashioned controls guy, but culture is the strongest form of control. So when you think about it in the organizational context, it's why information security awareness and training is useful. But I think, again, sometimes we go too far and we try and blame the user for things. We've got to look at it and go, what's our cultural adherence to these principles? How do we focus not only the security team and having its culture, the privacy team, broader aspects of IT, the broader technology team, the broader company and organization itself? What are those cultural underpinnings? What are the values? And then how do we, in essence, from the organizational culture at the top level, and the organizational values that have been set down, you know, whether it be the CEO and executive staff, if you're in a company, or if you're in a government institution, right, whether it be the legislator, the state, there's a culture that's there. And we've got to figure out how the artificial intelligence systems, how the security and privacy fit within the context of that culture, and bind those things together. And again, as I've mentioned, trust. And trust for me is a simple equation. It's a combination of competence and character. Your competence is the capabilities that you have, the results that you deliver. So, you know, can you demonstrate, this gets back to that robustness of the AI. Can we demonstrate the results we're getting out of this? Can we show that with an AI-based advanced network transport analysis capability that we can shrink the time to detect, shrink the time to contain, see more of what wasn't seen before? That's the competencies. The character gets back to, again, it's the culture. What's the intent? What's the leadership like? What's their purpose? You know, can you see the integrity in the individuals? And can you see that demonstrated in the decisions they're making, the actions they're taking, the things that they lean in on, not only internally in their internal operations, but externally in the partnerships they have, in the things that they share socially, so that you've got again a level of that culture, and you really can see who they are and what they stand for. And now let's transition to principles. I'm a principle person first and foremost. You know, again, you look at the etymology of the word. It's the origin. It's the source. It's that moral rule or belief that helps you know what's right and wrong and influences your actions. And you know, it could be my upbringing. I grew up Catholic, went to Catholic school and all that stuff. So you had ground in you many of these things from an early age. But again, I think even when I was in graduate school and subsequently Intel, there was always a code of conduct, a set of principles that were established as a part of the organizational context. I've helped create those for bigger organizations, but I've also created sub-principles for my own security team. And if you don't have those, I would suggest you do them. And again, they have to be bound to the broader organizational ones. But for me, principles first is the starting point. Now, policies, we're all familiar with those in the InfoSec context, and even privacy policies and HR policies and purchasing policies and expense policies. I mean, we've got so many policies out there. It's almost ridiculous. Heck, my internal InfoSec policies, you know, the ones that I had helped create at Silence, the ones that working through for Cymatic, they're, you know, 140 pages long, give or take a little bit, right? So who's going to read all of that stuff? I mean, they are a set of rules, guidelines, you know, to help us ensure these things in InfoSec. But again, the root meaning of it is police, right? And I've heard a lot of peers that say they don't want to be the police force. But at the same time, you can't get away from enforcing policy. So we sometimes have these dilemmas on policies, but the reality of them is they're so deep and detailed that a lot of people don't read them. And certainly even if you read them, you wouldn't remember all the policies. Heck, I have a hard time remembering them. And I've generally been the one who's written them, co-written them, you know, approved them, whatever. So how do you get that kind of sweet spot between these things? And I think principles should come before policies. And the reason for that is I think of principles like a compass, a moral compass. And if you can train people, again, you know, for anybody who's, you know, Catholic or Christian, you get the 10 Commandments, everybody's heard of it, right? It's easier to train people on 5 or 10 core principles and have them be directionally correct. That'll mitigate a substantial amount of risk, not only in the broader security context and privacy context, but also in the AI context. What are your principles around the design, the development, the use of them? What are your principles for your data scientist, right? So they stay within certain bounds. And if people are directionally correct, when they start to get on a potentially slippery slope, they're more likely to then go raise their hand. They're likely to dive into the policies to get, again, the specific coordinates, right? So that's why I've got these pictures. Principles are like a compass. They'll give you directional stuff so that you're directionally correct. Policies are really at that, you know, 1 foot or below level type stuff, the longitude, latitude, height, you know, time coordinates, all of that type of stuff. We need both. But if you don't have the set of principles for security, if you don't have a set of principles for privacy, if you don't have a set of principles guiding what you're doing with AI, go do that. You know, as follow-up, I'm happy to share any of the principles that I've worked on and created and stuff like that, because if you don't have them, sometimes it's hard to start from nothing, and that's something that we can do as follow-up with anybody who wants those things. Now, again, when you start thinking about ethics and principles and dilemma, there's data out there to say that things that we've done in other aspects of our communities and our businesses has created some potential issues. You know, this from a few years ago, COMPAS, the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions System, and recidivism, if I said that correctly, is basically repeat offenders who've gone to jail. What's the likelihood that they're going to repeat again? And so this compass system was developed, and again, some research done on a few years ago highlighted some potential concerns and some perhaps biases in those algorithms, where the conclusion from these researchers was, there was mistaken labeling of low risk for one group of individuals, and correspondingly a set of higher risk for a different set of individuals. And again, I don't know, but I have read this study. I don't think anybody intended for this system to have racial biasing in it, but algorithmically, it appears that it did. And so, again, when you find these things, you've got to go back and then reevaluate, again, those small decisions that were then coded and codified into the recommendations in a system. And again, this is just one example. There's another example here, Princeton Review. Again, people probably are familiar with it, online tutoring capability. And this came out of, again, that discrimination in AI and algorithmic decision-making from the Council of Europe in that paper. And again, what they had found was there was some biases in the pricing practices. Now, again, as a former finance guy, as a business leader, and stuff like that, we would all like to price discriminate to increase our margins as much as possible. And organizations do that all the time, right? The question is, when we're doing it and how we're doing it, is there an unintended consequence? Is there a bias in there? And in this case, the bias that was identified was, again, with regard to certain ethnic groups that were paying more, and not necessarily because they had the income to. And so, again, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it right? Is it wrong? Those are questions that need to be asked. On the one hand, you could say, again, price discrimination and being able to charge more in some contexts is a good thing for your business. But in the context when you understand it from this perspective, is that the right thing to do or not? The questions that we should be asking. Now, again, as was mentioned earlier, AI is pervasive and growing more so day in and day out. And certainly, autonomous cars. My parents are both, gone and both passed away years ago. But as I saw them age as they got into their late 70s and 80s, and the inability to drive, and my wife and I had to drive them around doctor's appointments, groceries, stuff like that, which was really great. It was wonderful to be able to do that for them. But I look forward to the day, and I hope there's a day out in my future when I get to that point that I can go to an autonomous car, have it take me to the grocery, have it take me to a doctor's appointment, have it drive me to the beach so that I don't have to, ask my kids and take away from their day, and have that freedom, right? Because I saw for my parents that restriction that it created for them. Their world shrunk tremendously when they couldn't drive anymore. And so we had to try and manage and mitigate that different ways. And hopefully with autonomous cars, for all of us down the road, we'll be able to have greater freedoms and flexibility. But the thing that I've always thought about is, again, the AI in that car and how it was developed, who developed it, the decisions that it could make. And so I've even dating back to my time at Intel years and years ago, thinking out about where this stuff could go, even 10 years ago, the implications of these things. And I always had this moral dilemma. Let's say I'm 90 years old and I go to my car and it's taking me to my doctor's appointment. My doctor's appointment is, for treatment for cancer. And my calendar is connected into the car. It knows where I want to go. It knows the context of the appointment. It knows my age. And that cancer appointment is meant to give me chemo and radiation and extend my life, perhaps 6 months longer. And so the car knows that, knows all the data, and I'm driving through my neighborhood and a bus stops. Now, a child runs out from around the corner of the bus, and the car has all these sensors. What is the AI going to do? What if there's a preserve life mode, right, option, which I can imagine there could be. And then the question becomes, you know, who lives or who dies? Did I set it to preserve my life? And the car can calculate and know that if it jammed on the brakes, it's going to hit the kid, and the kid is likely going to die. Or does it turn a different direction, perhaps go into the tree, recognizing there's nobody there, and I might die? Who decides that? Is it the driver? What if there's other passengers in the car? Is it the car company? You know, how was that even AI preserved life math model even created? And then you've got to ask the question, again, that we've all seen because the Jeep hacking a few years ago and other stuff, what sort of security is in place to mitigate even someone taking control of the car? These are all security, privacy, ethical, moral decisions that, and again, this feature is not that far off. And so we need to be thinking about that. And then, you know, if you're not in a car company, again, your context is one of a buyer or the one who's deciding, you know, flip this on to preserve others' life, flip it this way to preserve my life. But are there implications like this for the organizations you're in and the AI you're creating, the AI you're deploying, the AI you're using? If folks have seen and heard my 9 box of controls probably more often than they care to, but it's the context of how I think about controls, which is why I always bring it into things. Again, 3 primary ways you can control for risk: prevent, detect, respond. 3 primary things that how you can implement those controls: automated, semi-automated, manual. As you go from prevention to response, risk grows. From automated to manual, cost grows. And again, 3rd dimension of control, friction. Those controls that impede business velocity and disrupt the user experience. Now, AI in the context of my 9 box, you know, automated, you know, controls that are AI driven or AI enhanced, perhaps with no human involved, right? When a system is taking action without us, my perspective is our diligence on what action it's taking needs to be higher. If it's semi-automated and AI is assisting, again, you've got some human involvement. Again, humans are prone to failure though, so they can make the wrong decision. So either way, we've just got to think about if it's fully autonomous, getting back to the autonomous vehicle, if it's fully autonomous, really understanding what decisions it's making, any potential biases it has, any, again, implications on your business, on your employees, on your customers, on society. So AI in the context of security, I am a huge believer in it. It's one of the reasons why I've associated myself with not only the companies that I've worked for, but companies like Awake, because I can truly see the substantial benefits of AI in security, you know, in our ability to lower risk because we can cover more ground, make better decisions, take actions before bad things happen or harm gets magnified. We can have a lot less time playing whack-a-mole, spinning in circles, reacting to things, which again lowers our cost. And, you know, if we can determine the right person and device without disruption, again, lower friction. So again, going back to my 9 box, I can see the value benefits. I can see the business outcomes of the application of AI in security. But again, some of that comes with the level of potential concerns. You know, the data collection, the use, the privacy of the user. Again, is there automation bias? Are we trusting the system too much? Again, I think we're all familiar with false positive, false negative. That's a typical thing we look at. But in other contexts, particularly when you're trying to identify a human versus a machine, or is it the right human? Again, is there discrimination possible? if you're looking at those type of things, mouse movements, keystrokes, machine stuff, could you potentially identify a health issue, or somebody maybe having a few glasses of wine and might be impaired, or perhaps sentiment analysis? Again, there's organizations that are using AI in the context of screening emails and posts and stuff like that. Now, that's useful for identifying, for marketing purposes, positive things, negative things you need to worry about the brand. It's useful for spotting insider risk and stuff like that. But is it also perhaps dangerous in the fact that, a management team could target an employee or a category of employees because they've expressed concern in some way, right? And what other things could we potentially infer? And what are our boundaries around the use of that data? I mentioned this over and over again before, but I love this quote. Risk surrounds and envelops us. Without understanding it, we risk everything. Without capitalizing on it, we gain nothing. So for me, this whole talk is about getting us to contemplate not only the useful implications of AI, because I think they're enormous, but the potential downsides of it. Because if we don't understand the risky aspects of these things, we will be substantially generating risk, and our job is to manage and mitigate it. But we need to run sometimes to these risky things in order to understand them and capitalize on it. So again, it just becomes a philosophical issue of how we optimize our decisions and how we contemplate risks. And I think, again, if we contemplate them right, we'll be able to better manage and mitigate them. Which comes to these things: if you don't make a choice, you don't make the choice to think about the ethical implications of these things, the privacy implications of AI in the context of security, that choice will make you. And sometimes it's not about what we do, but it's about what happens if we don't do it. Again, getting back to the actions, the discussion, the dialogue we need to have. So like questions of where did your data come from? And how would you deal with something like this? This is actually from a paper, a dialogue, a discussion that happened with these researchers a few years ago. And some people on this panel believed that it was okay to use data that was in the public domain that was perhaps there because of illicit origin. It was stolen and released and published. Again, that's an ethical choice to make. Are you going to use that as a part of your training set? Are you going to use that as a part of your marketing efforts? Are you going to use that perhaps in the context of security, even though it wasn't intended to be out there by the employee or the users or someone else? Now, does this change your perspective? There's been, for decades and decades and decades, moral dilemmas in the healthcare arena around using the experiment data from the Nazis during the Holocaust and World War II. Is that okay to use in the medical context, considering they did it by torturing people? They did so many inhumane items. And the reason why I'm giving this juxtaposition is it's different, the context is different, but the basis of it is the same. They were harming people in so substantially a bad way, and there's data out of it. Is it okay to use that data? I don't have an answer for you, but it is a moral dilemma, just like using data that was stolen or leaked on the internet as a part of your AI models, as part of your marketing efforts, as part of your security context. You need to think about, again, from a principled perspective, is that okay or not? Or in what context the proportionality exists that it would be appropriate to use. There's a great book, Blind Spots, Why We Fail to Do What's Right and What to Do About It. If you haven't read it, it's a fantastic book. Again, some other examples, I think we're all familiar with the Ford Pinto. Go back in history, Lee Iacocca was running the Pinto division. I don't think he was trying to kill people when he shipped the Pinto. But if you look at it in the context of the research that's been done on it, Ford was facing increasing pressure in the low-end car market from Volkswagen. It brought the Pinto to market in the fastest time it had ever designed, developed, and started getting ready to ship a car. They had some ideas and some safety data that indicated there was a potential issue with certain collisions. But when you tease through the details of it, Ford actually had a patent on a safer gas tank and a part that was $11. But they framed the choice to ship the car for several years in the one of profit and loss and financial liability. They didn't put it in the context of human life. And that biased the decision they made. And they shipped the car for several more years. Now, other data points that some of us might remember, I remember this one acutely. I had just come back from a class. I was at UC Santa Cruz my freshman year of college, and the launch of the Challenger was just going on January 28th, 1986. Again, picture perfect launch. But 73 seconds after liftoff, we all remember what happened. The Challenger exploded. But again, when you look through the research on the incident and the decisions and all that stuff, if you go through the gory details of those reports, you'll find that NASA and Morton Thiokol there were several launches of the Challenger and the shuttles before then. There had been some potential O-ring issues. There was been some suspicion that it had to do with temperatures in the morning, and the engineers were raising concerns. But NASA was under incredible pressure to not have another delayed launch because they had multiple delayed launches. And so they basically escorted the technical folks, the engineers, out of the room to make a quote-unquote management decision. And the way in which they asked the questions biased the answers. And what they did was they looked at it and said, well, yeah, there's some suspicions, but there's no proof that we're going to have a problem tomorrow. But if they had asked the questions a different way, if they had looked at the data slightly differently, they would have seen of the prior several launches, all be directionally collect, there was 5 or 6 of them that had O-ring issues. If they had looked at the temperatures of when they launched, they would have seen that the temperatures where they had some O-ring concerns were at, I'll be directionally correct, 38 degrees. And if they looked at the forecast for the next morning, seeing it was going to be 32, they could have more likely concluded that they were going to have an O-ring issue that then could have caused a problem. But they didn't do it that way. So the key points on these things, again, the pressures, the management decisions, the way in which you frame the question sometimes can lead to disaster. Hence why I always try and tease out multiple perspectives in not only the traditional cyber risk, but I'm pushing us to do that same thing in the AI implications. AI systems are often black boxes. They can lead to unintentional issues. How were the target and class variables defined? How were you labeling the data? How were you collecting the data? The feature selection, the proxies that you might use if you don't have the real data, do you use a proxy, and does that proxy then have a potentially hidden bias there? We need to understand those things. Otherwise, again, we might be magnifying security issues. The security AI solutions we're choosing might create a problem, or there might be privacy implications or other discriminations that could occur. So we need to be concerned with that opaqueness of decision. That's why transparency is such a big thing in this space. Our focus areas got to be privacy and data governance. Are people products? Is data use consistent with the purpose stated? Have we gone beyond the typical definitions of PII? Are people just thinking, my social security number, these things, or are they looking at the machine data that we're collecting and again, the association to that to an individual? That has privacy implications. The transparency, again, do we detail our practices? Do the vendors that we buy AI solutions from, are those details transparent for us? Can we understand them? Is there something hidden that in the details that if became known would cause a problem? Again, I've already mentioned on discrimination and fairness, how are we evaluating that? And ultimately, who's accountable? Is it the CIO? Is it the Chief Privacy Officer, CTO, Chief Security Officer, legal, business owner? Yeah, accountability for me is who's the decision maker? And that decision maker or decision makers, if it's a group, is collectively accountable. And then we've got to think about responsibility and code of conduct, from not only the executive team, but direct managers, but all the way down to the data scientists and our vendors and consultants. I've created code of conducts for the data science teams in the organizations that I've done. Why? Because they have access to a tremendous amount of data. They can start inferring or questioning things, and I want them to really think about the implications of it and the harm they could create and the responsibilities that they have to not do something harmful, or if they go down a slippery slope, make a mistake, that they stop and they raise their hand immediately and then go ask for help from security and privacy and legal and the ethics team that's necessary. Again, lots of moral dilemmas here, and good book on the moral maze. And again, these ethical things are not necessarily directed at those who are bent on doing evil, not the bad people, but really these things are at the good people, where our convictions are sometimes drained by intellectual and moral confusions. That's why I'm pushing these type of items, because we have to think about them for ourselves and not just say we're good people, we're in the security team trying to do the right thing for our organizations. We might be on slippery slopes when it comes to these moral and ethical dilemmas. Another good book, Giving Voice to Values. Again, ethical dilemmas in business are often met with silence. And again, in the context of the Pinto and the Challenger and other things, it's not because the right answers were unknown, it's because the right conversation wasn't initiated. And I think that that's our responsibility. The inconvenient truth about ethics is it can't be cherry-picked. We need to make sure that we don't succumb to ethical fatigue. It's exhausting, it's tiring. We need to also not wrap ourselves around the axle and do this analysis paralysis, but we got to ask the thoughtful questions and make sure we're contemplating these things and pose those high contrast questions to ensure the right dialogue and debate occurs with the right people in the room. Culture is key. I've mentioned that before. We've got to speak up at times. We got to speak out, and we also need to know who we're speaking for. Again, for me, it's all about protecting and enable the people, the data, and the business, and that people is our employees, our shareholders, our customers, society beyond just the business, right? And we need to think about that, the risk in those ways as well. And one last thing to consider here, it's a concept across ethics in a variety of professions called stupid obedience. And I see a lot of times stupid obedience in organizations, sometimes heck, even in the security and privacy teams. And there's a difference between the stupid and the negligent, but stupid obedience and people who make stupid decisions resemble negligence at times. And the stupid fail because they don't know better, right? Negligent folks generally know better and just haven't done the right thing. But the most common form of stupid obedience is again going back to the principles or code of ethics. It's reading each rule, each principle, as if they were independent of each other, and they're not. They're a collective. Policies can be applied differently. Principles generally can't. So just contemplate that as you're navigating these issues for your organization and your team. With that, thank you, and we'll turn it over and see what comments or questions we have.
Thanks, Malcolm. Based on the feedback in the chat channel, you definitely struck a few chords with the audience. We have time for a few questions. Here's a little bit of a contrarian one, I guess. What about the ethics of not using AI in security? Would there be a case to be made that not using it would be unethical?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm glad that was raised. There's a lot of folks that are shy of looking at innovative security technologies, and they want to do old school NIDS or maybe signature-based AV or whatever. But we know those controls are failing. We know they don't give us the visibility. We know that they generate a higher residual risk and higher cost to our organizations. And so I absolutely think there's an ethical issue if people are not aggressively pursuing AI to reduce their risk, reduce their cost, and protect their organizations and their customers better. Absolutely.
Perfect. Next question. Where do you see the most ethical issues with AI and security? I hear many talk about displacement of workers, automation. Is that really a concern in security? And I guess this is kind of related to your previous question as well.
Yeah, well, again, if you think of the broader context of things in the United States and Europe and stuff like that, there's even the World Economic Forum talks about AI and the labor implications and how many people it might put out of work, and then how do we not then create, again, a broader societal gap because we've automated people out of work and then create a societal issue. In the security industry, it's completely different, right? You look at every publication, we're short 3 million jobs, 2 million jobs, all that stuff. And so this gets back to we have a moral obligation to solve that labor shortage. Some of it is by growing the talent, but some is also by deploying AI. So that way we can better manage and mitigate the risk, get better results and outcomes. And so I don't see AI as a disruptor in putting security folks out of work. I think it will put us into a little bit more economic balance considering the shortage of people that we have.
And continuing with that theme of AI and security, our next question says, you mentioned trust in design, development, and use. I am buying a number of AI security solutions. Do I need to assess my vendor's ethics? Do you think it's already covered in my third-party risk efforts? And I'll combine another question into there as well. What are some, really tactical questions I should be asking my vendors in this regards?
Yeah, great question. I would venture to say there's two things of AI and security. There's a bunch of people who are marketing AI and security or actually not doing anything close to AI. So one, make sure you're doing that robustness and make sure that they are really using artificial intelligence, machine learning, and stuff like that so that you're not just buying into the marketing message, first off. Two, I would venture to say that the third-party risk questionnaires, which are typical controls that you're driven based upon SOC 2 or some other compliance regime, don't go enough into the details to understand that. Again, do you know if your security company looks at that data and looks at what they might be collecting about your employees, your users, your customers? Are those people products? Are they sharing that data? And under what context are they doing that? Are they monetizing it in different ways? Are they selling it out? So there's a variety of questions that I think that you need to think about. And then I think it's also appropriate to ask for your security vendors corporate social responsibility guidelines. Ask them if they have a code of conduct for the data scientist. Ask them their set of corporate culture and corporate principles. Because again, and then just watch what they do. Look at who they are. Look at the things that they share and associate themselves with. Again, getting back to integrity. Those questionnaires generally don't touch on that stuff. I don't think it's that hard to assess, but I would go about assessing that and reviewing those type of principles and policies and codes of conduct to just make sure that I feel comfortable that they are doing the right things the right way and they're holding their own data scientists accountable appropriately to make sure there's no bias or make sure when they're playing with data, if they happen to be on a slippery slope, that they're held accountable to pause and ask, Mother, may I, or I made a mistake, what do I do now?
Thanks, Malcolm. That's a good segue into our next question. You mentioned principles before policy. Can you give us an example of how to apply that in security? And kind of a related question that I'm going to combine is, what do you recommend when I experience pushback for introducing these principles?
Yeah, good question. So I'll walk back into my Intel days. I think most organizations that we all belong to have some level of corporate organizational values. Those values are codified in great place to work, customer first, whatever they are. So if the company doesn't have a set of codified corporate social responsibility principles, there's probably some cultural values or principles there that you can hook into. And if somebody gives you pushback, I go straight to those values and connect your principle with the value and say, why are you giving me pushback? If we have a value as an organization that says customer first, and our security actions are not demonstrating a customer first corporate value, there's a disconnect. And so that's how I've always resolved those things, because I could always go anchor to a corporate value, or again, dating back into my Intel days, when Intel started creating its Ethics and Compliance Oversight Committee and Corporate Social Responsibility Principles circa 1998-ish. Once those got codified and then I tripped my way into security a few years later, I was able to extend those social responsibility principles to say we need to have security by development, life cycle and privacy by design to drive a cohesion and a connection to the principles and the values of the company into security and privacy. It sometimes can be a little bit more tricky, and I'm certainly happy to take offline with anybody who might need help on that. But that's generally how I've done it.
So I think we have time for maybe one last question. This one's an interesting one too. Do you think at some point AI will be at a place to take the place of certain security roles, and would then at that point be a potential insider threat with bias?
Oh, really interesting question. And I think the answer to that is to some extent, yes, right? So you think of even in the financial industry, you've got AI making trading decisions, right, on our stock portfolios and stuff like that. So you've basically eliminated some of the manual analyst work that used to be done. But now people have moved into creating those algorithms. So I think it's a move up, right? So you think of, again, different example, somebody who used to pick cotton by hand. Now you've got the machines that did it. Well, you change the nature of the farm worker and maybe have less of them, but you're collecting more, you're doing it faster, so the labor shifts. So I do think we will see labor shifts in AI as it applies to security. And in some cases, yeah, that might mean a role change or role elimination. But again, that you're exactly correct. Could that decision in the AI be triggered to take action maliciously? I've said for a long time, think of something that's not AI at this point, but DLP. DLP is a control that doesn't work, in my opinion. And I know too many instances where the bad guys ring the DLP bell as a distraction. So they triggered the control to distract you to think that they're are exfiltrating stuff, which they are, but that's a distraction to get you to run one direction so they could actually hide going in a different direction. So even in the context of traditional security tools, they're being used by the bad guys in some cases to fool us. And so, yeah, we definitely need to be cognizant of that with respect to AI, which again gets back to the robustness, it gets back to the biases, it gets back to understanding the tool that you bought and the implementation and use of it, as well as having an appropriate degree of skepticism around that automation bias. Is it being used against me, or is the signal accurate?
Thanks, Malcolm, and thanks again for sharing your thoughts and insights on this topic. We unfortunately are all out of time. Thank you, everyone, for attending. If you would like to share the recording, these are available on Awake's YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you at the next Awake Security webinar. Visit us at awakesecurity.com or on our social feeds for more information. Thanks again.